This is the criteria used for every cigar review that goes up on the Cigar Public website. Cigar Public is a website where you can go to get information on new cigars coming out, special drops, limited edition blends, industry news, and cigar reviews, of course. I'm lucky enough to be one of the about 30 cigar reviewers that regularly submit cigar reviews to Cigar Public. And like I said at the beginning of the video, this is the criteria that we use. And if you look at the criteria, you'll see that it's broken down into three main parts. We've got the construction, the flavor, and the appearance. And after you judge those three things, at the end, you as the reviewer get to put in your own input, and there is an overall enjoyability section, which I'll get to toward the end of the video. And after that overall enjoyability, there's also a strength and intensity section, which don't really go into the actual score of the cigar, which I think is fair, but they are there in case folks want to know them. And just starting off with those, for the strength of the cigar, the way that we do it on Cigar Public is we go, it's either a plus or a minus. You can call it a medium plus if you want, or a plus plus. You can do whatever you want there. I usually just go plus minus, especially since it doesn't really have much to do with the score of the cigar. I try not to focus too much on getting too minute or too into the minutia of the strength. Intensity is the same thing. We've got three options for intensity. There's low, medium, and full. That's self-explanatory. Now, strength and intensity, I'm gonna get into it a little bit later with the dynamic range and the complexity a little bit. I think dynamic range has a lot to do with boldness, and sometimes I think that that's kind of where intensity comes in as well. So intensity does kind of get represented up near the top, whereas strength for me doesn't really get represented. It's just the way I do it. All right, so we're kicking it off with construction. And the very first thing in construction is worth 10 points in the overall score of the cigar, and that is the draw. The way I like to think about the draw of a cigar is the same way that you would think about going to a restaurant and you're going up to that fountain and getting yourself a fountain drink. And there's three different straws that you could, theoretically have. You could have a coffee stirrer, you could have a regular straw, and then you could have a like bubble tea or boba tea straw. If you have a bubble tea straw, or those big boba tea straws, then you're gonna take that fountain drink in too fast. You're gonna finish it faster than you expected to finish it. You're gonna get more than you want. And overall, you're not really gonna have as much enjoyability out of the drink. Same thing with the cigar, or same thing with the coffee stirrer. If you're drinking that fountain drink through a coffee stirrer, there's not enough coming up. You're trying to pull too hard, so it's not really giving you the satisfaction that you might want. And it's just not going to be a good experience overall. It's going to take much longer than you want. After you take a bite of the food, it's going to take too much to actually satiate your thirst. And that coffee stirrer is just not going to be as good. So those two represent what I think are bad draws, where a bubble tea or like a big boba tea straw would represent a loose or open draw that's too loose and too open, and a coffee stirrer would represent a draw that's much too tight. So both of those two would represent draws that would not get 10 points in my opinion. What would get a 10 in my opinion is something like that regular size straw, where you're getting as much of the fountain drink as you expect. You're finishing the fountain drink at an expected rate. You're enjoying it the way you've always expected to enjoy it. You're used to having that fountain drink. You know how the experience is gonna go. And that's what that medium or regular size straw is gonna get you, in the same way that a perfect draw or a good draw on a cigar will help you smoke the cigar at an expected rate. It's going to satiate because it's giving you the right amount of smoke, and it's not going to overheat the cigar while keeping it lit appropriately, so that you're getting the exact flavor profile or the exact experience that the blender was hoping for you to get. I haven't gotten too many 10s on a draw. I don't know if I've gotten any because it's tough. The draw is really hard to get just right, but I've gotten plenty of 8s and 9s. That's usually where I find most cigars kind of live. All right, moving on to the burn. This is also a 10-point section. And the burn for me is based on mainly three things. And those are how thin is that combustion line And the thinner that dark burn line or combustion line is, the better that the tobacco was processed, the better that the tobacco was fermented, the better that the tobacco was aged, the better that the tobacco was processed and handled overall over its lifetime before it got to your humidor and before you smoked it. So a thin combustion line for me is always a good thing. The next thing is how strong the ash holds on, and I don't judge it for more than maybe an inch or an inch and a half. The final part of the burn for me is it uneven? Is there any canoeing? Are there any holes that develop below the combustion line? If I have to do a bunch of touch-ups where I'm taking a lighter to it to keep that burn even. So for the burn, to me, it's easier than it is for the draw because you've got that combustion line that's going to stay the same throughout, so you're kind of judging it on that. If the burn isn't even, then that can happen at each third, so you might be taking a point off at each third, maybe even more points if you're having to touch it up. The ash starts getting rough, it starts splitting, doesn't look nice and tight. I think that burn is a really good way to judge the experience of smoking that cigar from a construction perspective. As we move on to the second category of flavor, we start with complexity. For me, complexity is how many flavor notes am I picking up? Anytime I'm picking up more than 4 flavors, for me, that's going to be a complex cigar. And complexity is a 10-point category. So if I'm getting 4 flavors, you're already going to get up over 6-7 points. And the more flavor notes I'm getting, the higher that point is going to go. And especially with regards to transitions. Does a graphite turn into a coffee? Does a real mellow, sweet wood turn into a honey? Does graham cracker develop out of a honey note in the first third? Any of those transitions, for me, are going to add to the points that a cigar can get in complexity. But I'm going to do a baseline of 4. If I'm getting less than 4 flavor notes, then it's going to have a little bit of a lower score. Just because for these blind cigar reviews, I'm not really judging it based on that, I want to have a nice coffee cigar and I only really want 1 or 2 flavors in there and I don't want those flavors to change. That's not really what I'm looking for in a cigar review, but it is something I might mention in my narrative or my overall thoughts. I might say something like that, like, hey, there weren't a lot of flavor notes in this cigar, so that's why it got a low score on complexity, but the notes that were there were nice and they were consistent, and this might be the perfect cigar for this or that or this. So just because it gets a low grade or a lower score on complexity doesn't mean it's a bad cigar, but it is one of the criteria that we use at Cigar Public. The next one is dynamic range, and for me, dynamic range has a lot to do with those transitions that I was talking about earlier and how bold the flavors are. So that if I'm really tasting coffee or cinnamon or chocolate, if those are really bold notes and they're transitioning beautifully and they're mixing with cream and wood and leather and the aromas and the earthiness that I'm getting really works well together in a bold way, for me, it's going to score well on dynamic range. And dynamic range is important because that boldness and how much of a transition you have throughout the cigar can really impact the experience and can really, for me, make it a good experience because as a reviewer, you're getting more things that you can pull out of a cigar. I do acknowledge that maybe for folks that aren't reviewing cigars and they're just enjoying them, I don't know that this is the most important thing. So that's what we got for dynamic range. That's also a 10-point category. All right, so as we go into that third category, appearance, these are 5-point categories. And this is a lot that has to do with before you're smoking the cigar. So the first thing is the wrapper. And the wrapper, you can look at it in a few different ways. There's different things that different folks like. Different reviewers, I've noticed, like different things. The traditional way to look at it is how consistent is the color of the overall wrapper, how tight is the roll, so how visible are the seams, how many veins are in the leaf of the wrapper, so how smooth is that wrapper, and then the color that you're getting from the wrapper based on what you're looking for. Obviously, there's Connecticut all the way to like a Maduro or an Oscuro, and everything in between. But I think the color in a lot of ways also has something to do with oiliness. So how shiny or how much of a sheen is on the wrapper. For me personally, if I have a Maduro and it's a really heavy cigar with a nice thick wrapper and it's got some toothiness on there and the seams are tight, I'm not really worried about how consistent the color is and how many veins there are. Just like if there's a Connecticut and it's got a beautiful sheen on there, not super oily and shiny, but a nice sheen and it's an even color, for me, it's going to get a really good score for that Connecticut in the wrapper category. Anytime I'm taking points off for a wrapper, it's because potentially the pack isn't even, so that there's soft spots as you're feeling the cigar throughout. For all of these, I want to see a nice roll so that the wrapper's seam is tight. The smoke texture is the other category, and this one for me is a little bit simple in that it's just how thick that smoke is, how chewy that smoke is. Am I getting the right amount of smoke so that I'm satiated, I'm satisfied by how much smoke I'm taking in? To me, this one is tied directly to the draw. And if it's a nice aromatic smoke that is nice and chewy and thick, most of the time it's going to get a 5 from me. If the draw is bad and I'm barely getting any smoke, then the smoke's going to get a lower score from me. And that's kind of how I do the smoke. Now, the last category is worth 50 points, and it's the overall enjoyability. And this is where the cigar reviewer personally gets to add their spin on how they experience that cigar. If I've got a good smoke that burned evenly, my enjoyability is going to be higher. If there was a flavor profile that I like added on top of that, my enjoyability is going to be higher. If both cigars smoked great, my enjoyability is going to be higher. And that's where I'm going to leverage my own experience to give either a better overall enjoyability note or less, so that if a cigar is real earthy and it's got a lot of mushroom notes that maybe I don't enjoy as much, I'll take it down a little bit on overall enjoyability. But again, I'll mention that and I'll say, I'm not the type of person that likes a lot of mushroom notes in cigars or that mustiness, or like super aged cigars that have like not a lot of flavor, so that I will, and I know that probably sounds crazy to some folks, but that's just me. Then I'll mention that in my narrative, so that for folks that do like that kind of thing, they can add their own analysis to it and decide on their own whether or not for them that matters as much, and maybe in their opinion they would have bumped it up a little bit on overall enjoyability. So there you have it. That is the criteria that we use for the Cigar Public Reviews. Like I said, there's about 30 reviewers. We each get packages that we request when we're done with reviews, and that comes with usually 3 or 4 different cigars, and we get 2 of each cigars, and we don't know anything about those cigars other than obviously what we see and the criteria here. We don't know the exact sizes. Obviously the bands are taken off. The cellophane doesn't have any stickers on there to give you any idea of what's going on. And that's how we do the cigar reviews. I think it's a great way to do it. I think it's a great criterion. I think it makes for very reasonable, fair scores that aren't always super high, but they're always reasonable, and I think they're always at the right level. I haven't seen a lot of cigar scores that I'm like, oh, I would have scored it totally different. It's usually within 3 or 5 of what I would have scored it, if not exactly what I would have scored that cigar. So I think it's a good criteria. I think this card specifically is a good way to do the reviews. The only thing I would add is that I would give 5 points back on dynamic range if I could have 5 points for a new category of price, so that keeping the cigar review blind, so that I don't know anything about the brand or the cigar or how old the cigar is, how fermented it is, or how aged the cigar. I don't know anything about the cigar, but you tell me the price of the cigar only. That's the only information. And then I get to judge based on the experience that I had with the cigar and how I rated the cigar, how worth it is on a scale of 1 to 5 to pay for that cigar. I think it's something that might be useful. That's my only real point on this criteria. And that's it. Check out the site. I'm on there. There's a lot of other great reviewers on there. There's a lot of great articles. Some of the reviewers do articles. Danny's always posting something up. He's always got industry news on there, weekly roundups of what's happened around social media and press releases. There's whiskey pairings. There's coffee pairings. There's plenty of stuff over there. It's a cool site to check out if you're into cigar culture and cigar reviews. And that's it from me today. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I've got more content on the way, and have a good one.